There was something in Jesus' eyes that night that Judas had never seen before. It wasn't judgment nor surprise. It was a silent goodbye. Between the wine and the bread, between words of peace and piercing glances, the air felt too heavy to breathe. And even surrounded by 12 men, Judas felt there were only 2 at that table, himself and the one who knew. But why did Jesus look at Judas with tenderness, knowing what he was about to do? And why didn't Judas turn back, even with his feet washed, and the bread handed to him by Christ himself? The words, "One of you will betray me," didn't surprise him. What surprised him was how they were spoken. There was no anger in the voice, only certainty. He looked at Jesus, expecting to find harshness, coldness, maybe even contempt. But he found mercy, and that disarmed him more than any punishment. Jesus' face wouldn't leave his mind, calm, serene, as if he had accepted the pain before it even arrived. That look from the supper still burned in him. Judas clenched his fists, trying to crush the memory, as if punishing himself physically could silence the scream rising from within. But the scream grew louder. It screamed that he wasn't forced, that he chose, and that Jesus knew, and still looked at him with tenderness. It was as if that man was saying with his eyes, "I still see you, even now." Because that look was an accusation. It was a goodbye, a last chance. His hands trembled. His eyes turned away. Judas walked through the alleys of Jerusalem with slumped shoulders, as if carrying the weight of the sky itself. The silver in his hands, cold and mute, made no sound, but every step thundered in his mind. The 30 coins didn't weigh in his pockets. They weighed on his soul. At every corner, he tried not to be seen. But what tormented him the most was knowing that, even hidden in shadows, Jesus had already seen him completely. Time seemed to stop as he chewed that piece of bread like someone chewing on a decision. And when he swallowed his choice too. And because within Judas, there was already a pain older than any betrayal, the pain of never having felt truly chosen. While the others laughed and toasted, Judas's mind was somewhere else. In that moment, the bread dipped in the bowl became a symbol of something Judas couldn't fully grasp. Was it an offering? A pardon? Jesus continued the supper. Judas did not. For him, everything had stopped right there. The disciples' laughter echoed in the distance. The celebration faded. The wine lost its taste. The simplest gesture, a look, had just torn something open inside him. And though his feet were still there, his heart had already walked out the door. Night felt like a heavy cloak, muffling the sounds of the city. The path to the garden felt endless.
There was something sickening about it all. Why would that man of all people, the most accused? The glow of the Roman soldiers' torches flickered against the olive leaves. The sound of hurried footsteps, the clink of swords, the rustling of cloaks. The soldiers didn't know who Jesus was. The troop followed behind. The garden was drenched in darkness and prayer. There were Peter, John, the others, and Jesus, standing, already waiting, as if he had heard every step. Judas looked directly at him. For the first time, he found no resistance, no sadness, not even expectation precise, but full of noise inside. It was the same gesture that had sealed their friendship so many times before, but now it was a signal shouted cut off a soldier's ear. Chaos broke out. But even amid the confusion, Judas could only stare at one fixed point. Jesus' eyes, still on him, as if they wanted to say something, and as if, deep down, he already knew what it was. A betrayal, a silent scream, and, for Judas, a confession he dared not put into words. Just presence, no approval, just that same look from the supper. Judas wished there were anger, but Jesus remained steady, like someone who understood something Judas was incapable of grasping, and that tore him apart even more. A kind of presence that makes one tremble, even when nothing is said. They needed a sign, and that sign would be a kiss. The most aware choose to accept the kiss of the one who betrayed him. His heart raced, but not out of fear of the troops. It was something else, an old memory, when it all began. When he saw in that preacher from Nazareth not just a leader but a friend, a refuge, an ideal, a fire that could change the world, and perhaps heal his own emptiness. But that fire burned differently now. It seemed to have slipped from his hands, and he pursued another kind of control, one where he held the power, the command, even if it came at a dirty price. Judas wondered if it wouldn't have been better had Jesus faced the arrest with anger, with indignation. That would have made everything easier. But no. Cold fingers, a tense face, and yet he held his posture. When he stopped in front of Jesus, Everything seemed to stop with him. Time, air, the soldiers behind. The apostles, confused. There were only two. Once again, like at the supper, he knew the master would be there, firm, looking at him with the same eyes from the supper eyes that did not condemn. And because of that, condemned even more. In the distance, the Garden of Gethsemane could already be seen. Judas paused for a moment before crossing the last slope. He descended the slope. He approached slowly. Judas took a deep breath and whispered, "Rabbi." Then he pressed his lips against Jesus' face. A quick kiss. Jesus didn't step back. He didn't react either. He simply looked at him. There was no disdain. Peter stepped forward. When the soldiers dragged Jesus away, Judas didn't move. He stood in the same place, alone among trees that had witnessed the death of a friendship, his face still warm from the kiss, his mouth dry, and an anguish pounding in his chest like an untamed drum. He didn't cry. Not yet. The ground beneath his feet was the same, but the world around him no longer was. He had crossed an invisible line. The kiss had been given. Judas hadn't sold Jesus because of 30 coins. He sold him because he couldn't bear to look at himself anymore and see a man forgotten by God. Even while walking beside him every day, Jesus was already arrested, a shadow on the edge of history. No one knew what was happening in that corner of the tavern, where a man stared at coins like someone staring at shattered pieces of himself. The silver seemed to come alive. It stared back at him, and in the coins, he saw something he didn't expect to see. His own distorted face. Drank nothing. He simply opened the pouch on the table and poured out the contents. 30 scattered coins, 30 decisions stacked in silver. He tried to remember the first time he heard Jesus speak, when he thought that man would change everything. But the memory came back blurred, mixed with pride and resentment. He remembered thinking Jesus was wrong not to confront Rome. He remembered the silent anger when other disciples were praised, while he was just functional. Never intimate, never a rock, never junk. What remained now was emptiness, and the muffled sound of 30 coins clinking against each other inside the leather pouch tied to his belt. The tears would come later. When it sank in, his mind returned to the garden, to that look that paralyzed him, to the kiss that trembled on his lips. He wished it had been easier, that Jesus had pushed him away, had shouted. Spat turned his face, but no. He received the kiss. He allowed himself to be taken. He looked at him as if he still believed, and that hurt more than any punishment. When he realized that no amount of money in the world could pay for the value of a gaze that had trusted him. Until the end, the sound of shouting faded behind, but the echo did not. Judas walked through streets that now felt unreal. Judas stopped in front of a stone wall, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the coins with both hands. Their shine in the moonlight bothered him, as if mocking him. The metal was cold, but it burned in his palms. He looked at them, one by one, as if they could answer a question he didn't yet know how to ask. Then something hit him with silent force. None of those coins bore Jesus' face. He tried to walk, but his feet felt heavy. Judas entered an empty tavern and sat in a dark corner. He ordered nothing. And then he realized the betrayal wasn't born in the pouch. It was born in the mirror. Someone passed by and didn't recognize him. For the first time, that hurt. He was invisible now. He stood abruptly, left the tavern without picking up the money. The metallic clatter of the coins rolling on the floor stayed behind. Like a cruel laugh, he walked aimlessly through narrow streets, like someone fleeing from a mirror. But there was nowhere to run. At every corner, in every shadow, in every flicker of memory, he saw himself at the top of a small hill. He stopped before the locked gate of the temple. The same temple he had seen Jesus' questioned so many times. The same temple where he once believed justice lived. Now it seemed like a mute wall, a monument of silence, not because of the words, but because of the look, or rather, the absence of one. They didn't see him, not as someone bleeding on the inside. To them, Judas was just an instrument. Never part of the story, never human. The next morning, the city was still asleep. Judas entered unnoticed. His hands were sweaty, his face pale. He looked for the priests. When he found them, he threw the coins on the ground in rage and despair. I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood. But death was not yet his closest companion. It was the voice, not an audible one, but constant, intimate, burrowing into his bones. A voice that didn't come from men, not from the priests, not from the disciples. It was the voice of someone who knew his name, the voice of the one he had followed for 3 years, the voice of Jesus. Or perhaps, the idea of him. Their eyes reflected no compassion, only disdain, coldness, indifference. What do we care? That's your problem. That was the final blow. He ran out. The world spun. He felt the contrast like a cruel irony, the world being born in light, while he sank into the thickest darkness he had ever known. The field before him offered no shelter, no shade, only solitude. There, nature went on indifferent. The wind blew, the leaves danced, and Judas felt smaller than a speck of dust. And in his hands, the densest void he had ever felt. Not even death seemed punishment enough for what he carried. His chest burned. His eyes could no longer see clearly. His steps carried him to a dry field. where the wind blew without direction. There, alone, he fell to his knees. There were no prayers, no screams, only a silence so brutal it made his ears ache. The sun was timidly rising, but he didn't see it. On the ground, traces of damp earth still lingered. Above him, the branches of a twisted tree. But perhaps it was the only answer he had left to give. The sky was too bright for the pain Judas carried. Sitting at the foot of the tree, he held a rope between his fingers. You could still have come back. I washed your feet. I called you a friend. Judas squeezed his eyes shut, as if that could silence what roared inside him. He no longer knew if it was memory, if it was conscience, or if it was God trying to speak. But there was no clear answer. Only thunderous, fragmented thoughts. He spoke to himself in silence, hoping the sky would break, that time would stop, that someone would see him. He thought of Peter. Peter had failed too. He had denied 3 times. With firm words. With fear. He didn't know if he was crying or sweating. His body trembled. His throat was dry. There was no one left to blame. No crowd. No coins. No priest. Only him. Then another. The tree was still there. So was the rope, but something inside him still resisted. A spark. A flicker of doubt. It was more than he could bear. Judas felt the ground collapse beneath him. His mind spun. No tears. Just a sigh. A sound that felt like a plea. Not for death, but for relief. And in the midst of the whirlwind, only one certainty remained. He could no longer be that man. The man from the kiss. The man of silence. The one carrying guilt that never ends. The traitor, who loved too much to live with what he had done. What if, ... only God, and this abyss in between. An abyss with no reply. But Peter was alive. Of lifting adulterous women. But now, those words seemed as distant as childhood. He remembered them, but couldn't feel them. As if they were spoken for everyone, except him. Peter would still have the chance to look into Jesus' eyes again. But he, Judas, would not. The final look had already been given. The kiss sealed. The choice made. And that's what drove him mad. Knowing that forgiveness was there. But he didn't know how to touch it. Do you think he would forgive you? A command. A comforting thing, but all he received was the sound of wind brushing through leaves. No revelation, no presence. Just his own conscience. Louder than 1,000 crowds, even now. His body exhausted. His soul in ruins. He looked at the horizon and saw the sunrise carving through the hills. The same sun that once lit his steps beside Jesus. The same sun under which he had seen miracles. Multiplications, healings, resurrections, but now the warmth no longer reached his heart. It was as if another climate reigned inside him. A final winter after the kiss. Judas covered his face with his hand. For years he had heard Jesus speak of grace, of forgiveness 70 times 7, of loving enemies, of touching lepers. What if you're the exception? What if even grace has a limit? What if there's no way back? The silence of the sky was a punishment. Judas longed to hear a clear voice. He stood up slowly. He took a step. What if I ran? What if I shouted his name? What if he could still hear me? But another thought came fast, cruel as a blade. What if he doesn't want to anymore? That question broke him. At the base of the tree, he stopped, tied the knot with trembling fingers. There was no scream. The field remained quiet. The leaves danced once more. The sun rose a little higher in the sky. The city was, and among the many voices in that world, his went silent. But somewhere, perhaps where eyes cannot reach, a gaze remained steady. The same gaze from the supper, the same gaze from the garden, a gaze that never stopped seeing. Simple, firm, cruel. Judas had tied the rope with precision, like someone making sure there would be no doubt, no return. The branch was strong, bent like an old arm that would bear witness without saying a word. The field, empty of witnesses. Only the wind, a silent accomplice, touched Judas's sweaty skin as he lifted his eyes to the sky. He tried to push the image away, but it wouldn't fade. It was as if the future, somehow, had reached him before its time. What if he begged, ... not to be accepted, just to be heard? What if he faced the shame, the fury, the doubt in their eyes, as if the cross already existed and he was being forced to choose between it ... and the rope, searching for something that might already be gone, in the middle of a forgotten field, in front of a tree, just running, no rope, no direction, just his body in motion against the pain that kept him still. But his legs didn't move. There was something stronger than fear. Something inside whispered it was already too late, that the cross wasn't meant for him, that forgiveness like that was a privilege of those who still believed in the love of God. The knot was done, not the last, but as if seeking an agreement with his own end. An image suddenly invaded his mind. Vivid, piercing, unexpected. The weight on his chest was no longer just guilt. It was exhaustion of himself. Wood, blood, nails. And at its center, that same face that wouldn't leave him in peace. Jesus, no crown of glory, just wounded, torn, given, of what he had done, of what he couldn't undo. He was ready to go. or at least he thought he was. He took a deep breath, but as he held the rope and rested his forehead against the rough bark of the tree, the cross, he didn't actually see it. It hadn't been raised yet, but within him, it appeared as an unavoidable vision. Judas stepped back from the tree for a moment. His breathing grew shallow. Sweat ran down his temples. The rope was simple, quick, no prolonged pain, no explanations. A long road of humiliation, of public repentance, of rebuilding broken pieces before men who wanted him forgotten. And maybe worst of all, having to live with a memory every single day. The cross was something else. To live, that was the price of the cross. His mind exploded with possibilities. What if he dropped the rope? What if he ran to Peter, to John? And what if Jesus was still willing to see him again? He thought of running, but what if that was a lie? The idea was almost unbearable, that maybe, just maybe, the same gaze that forgave the thief on the cross might also be looking for him. Judas began to tremble. His hands, his mouth, his entire chest. A war raged within, between the voice of shame and the memory of grace. He sat back down. The rope fell beside him like a tamed animal, waiting for its command. And for the first time, he spoke out loud, weak, hoarse, as if he hadn't heard his own voice in days. Not forgiveness, a crack in the darkness, small but real. Would you still see me if I came back? The wind blew, but gave no answer. The sky remained bright, indifferent. But inside him, something small stirred. His legs wobbly, his mouth dry, then another, his heart racing, his body hesitant. There are still many stories to tell, of men who failed, wept, fell, and yet, somehow, were still seen by God. The knot was still there. Ready, he raised his head, looked at the rope, then at the horizon. The cross was still just a distant image, but somehow, it was real, a possibility. He stood up, but he wasn't anymore. He took a step back. The tree remained behind. The rope swayed gently in the wind, and he kept walking, not knowing where, not knowing what awaited, but away from the certainty of the end. The choice had been made, not between life and death, but between disappearing ... or being seen, even as a traitor, even as a failure, but seen, not by history, but by the one who never looked away. If this story moved something in you, subscribe to the channel.